I welcome you to tonight's program called Old God, New God, presented by Dr. Ilia Delio. This program is part of a collaborative relationship between Hartford International University and the Spiritual Life Center, Hartford. It is made possible by the generous support of the Forum for Life and Meaning, which is administered by both organizations. I like to say a few words about each of these organizations. Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, formerly known as Hartford Seminary, is an internationally recognized organization. It offers a PhD program in interreligious studies, three master's programs in chaplaincy, interreligious studies, and international peace building, a graduate certificate program in eco spirituality and interreligious studies, a leadership certificate called the Black Ministries Program, and it is home to the Center for Transformative Leadership and Spirituality. The Spiritual Life Center, which is an independent organization that has been serving the spiritual needs of the people for over 40 years. Since 2020, the center has been engaged with Hartford International University. In addition to nurturing the spirituality of HIU students, the Spiritual Life Center provides a wide range of programming and services for people from all walks of life and any spiritual tradition. We have something for everyone, no matter where you are on your life's journey. These offerings include individual and spiritual companioning, meditation, book groups and retreats, help for those making important decisions, programs and topics such as Enneagram and bio-spiritual focusing.
Dr. Ilia Delio is a Franciscan sister of Washington, D.C., a theologian specializing in the area of science and religion, and she has interests in evolution, physics, neuroscience, and the importance of these for theology. Ilia earned a doctorate in pharmacology from Rutgers University, where she specialized in neurotoxicology. She subsequently entered a Carmelite religious order and later became a Franciscan nun. Then Ilia earned a second PhD, this time in historical theology from Fordham University. Following graduation from Fordham, she taught in science and religion at Trinity College here in Hartford. She's also worked at the Washington Theological Union and Georgetown University. Ilia currently holds the Josephine C. Connolly Endowed Chair in Theology at Villanova. She's the author of over 20 books and founder of the Center for Christogenesis. If you've already read any of Dr. Delio's books or heard her podcasts, you know that we're in for a treat this evening. She is a deeply spiritual scholar of theology and science, a prophetic voice, a superb teacher with a bright sense of humor. I can tell you, as a pastor, a spiritual companion, and a human being, that I have benefited greatly from her work, and I'm confident that you will too. So, welcome, Ilia.
Thank you, Oscar. That's a really kind introduction. And it was so interesting to learn from Annie about the programs in your center. So I'm happy to be with you this evening and to share some insights on old God and new God. I do have a number of slides. Those of you who may have heard me before know that I love slides because pictures tell 1,000 words and I can fit a lot there. So let's begin with the slides and hopefully, can you see them, the slides? Good,
Yes.
great, super. So as Oscar mentioned, I started the Center for Christogenesis, originally known as the Omega Center, back in 2016. And it really has grown in 10 years worldwide. We have about 25 Christophany groups around the world, and people are eager to understand how science and religion can work together for the good of our planet and for the good of the whole. And part of this story really pertains, a good part of this story, in fact, the heart of it, pertains to what we're going to talk about tonight, and that is an old God and a new God. Now, I just want to begin with the name God because I think we've gotten very comfortable with this name and we have a certain idea of what God means for us. But from the point of revelation, if we go to Exodus 4:1-3, God says to Moses, when Moses asks, well, who shall I send sends me, and he says, well, tell them I am who I am. And that's a kind of a startling revelation for an identity. I am who I am. And then he says, tell the Israelites that I am has sent me to you. And so God reveals God's self as being, really, just I am, existence, I'm it, and, that beingness is, in a sense, what comes to kind of an explicit consciousness in Jesus of Nazareth, who was Jewish. And of course, we know that the Jews were anticipating the Messiah as they continue to do. But Jesus internalized this Torah and gave it a new authority from his own experience of God. And I think what Jesus, even in the Gospels, even in the Synoptic Gospels, we see that God is not some kind of stay-at-home God, but a mover, a get-involved God, a God who reaches out across boundaries. So, in a sense, that's what St. Paul writes in his second letter to the Corinthians. God was in Christ reconciling the world to God's self. We know all this, right? We've heard it. It's very lovely, but what does it mean for us today? That's our big question. We kind of have a working knowledge of what this might mean for us personally in our own spirituality. But I think to really get to the heart of the matter, and I think this is a crucial question, this question of God. If we have time this evening, I can talk a little bit more about why I think this is the most important question. And certainly it'll come up between this week and next week. First of all, the question of being. What does it mean to be? But what is reality? That's our basic question. So if we're going to talk about God, we have to talk about existence. Heraclitus thought that everything was changing. The world is changing. It's in constant flux. So being is change. Parmenides says, no, it may look like everything's in flux, but really there's only one single unchanging reality. Being is unchanging. So is it changing or unchanging? The ancients, went back and forth on this question. Aristotle said that being is essence. It's what something is in itself. And in the Middle Ages, like Avicenna said, well, God's essence is God's existence. So all these background ideas on being really gave rise to, we'll skip the analogy of being, but the fact is that God became this divine being and we could know something of God, an analogy of being. All substances are partly the same and partly different. But in a sense, God was, the cause of being, but we can never really know who and what God is. We only know sort of like what God does only by the effects in creation, goodness, beauty, wisdom. So God, for the early ancients was like the first cause, sort of the one who set everything in motion. And that led to this idea as God is the unmoved mover. That was a very Greek idea. That wasn't a Hebraic idea. The Jews had, an idea in the Torah that God is deeply relational. So they would not really agree with Aristotle's idea of God as the unmoved mover. But that's the kind of inherited, philosophy that we have, is that God is completely other. And therefore, God is the creator, but God is not really related to this world because God just created this world because God wanted to. But the world is really related to God. We need God because, well, we wouldn't exist in this worldview without God. And so we have this kind of one-way relationship. God's like, yeah, you're nice, but I don't really need you. And we're like, we really need you, God. So our lives are dependent on you. And of course, we, grew up with the idea is God is just perfect, right? That idea was like God is perfect being, divine being, all knowing, omniscient, all powerful, omnipotent, ubiquitous, everywhere present, and immutable. God never changes. So I hope these terms are somewhat familiar to you because, if you stuck around this story for a while, this is what you kind of learned. And we developed images. So, a lot of Christianity, in fact, actually all of it, really is based on this kind of ancient cosmology. Here's the Hebraic conception of the universe, very much like the Ptolemaic universe. It's concentric. You could see it's circular, it's earth-centered, it's geocentric, and it's static. So God ordered everything, God made everything into being, and God's on top, right? Because God doesn't really get too involved here. And so we grew comfortable with this idea. The Middle Ages developed a narrative. And I think, you start telling the story over and over and over, and we began to say, this is the truth, that we live in this perfect, immutable, hierarchical, because it's all layered, geocentric, anthropocentric, because we're at the center, this whole book of creation that God has lovingly ordered, like according to Genesis. Of course, we know that sin entered in because of Eve, who tempted Adam. And then we were fallen and depraved and needed redemption. It was really kind of a sad story when you think about it. It's like we're just weaklings that, hanging on to the very threads of God's graciousness and hope that we will be redeemed and saved from the fire of hell. And, Thomas Aquinas, following the Islamic philosopher Avicenna, developed this scheme like, okay, here's God, totally other, completely other, and yet the creator, the one who says, I think this is good, I think I'll create, and everything's flowing from God, emanation, and existing here in creation, and longing to return to God. So this scheme parallels the Ptolemaic universe, right? It's orderly, it's concentric, circular, coming from God, returning to God. God remains transcendent but immanent, right? God is more than us but present to us. And you know what's so interesting? Christian theology is an amalgam of Jewish thought, Greek thought, Greek philosophy, and Islamic philosophy. We've been pluralistic since day one. It's just amazing that we've never really acknowledged it as such. Of course, Thomas Aquinas, the famous Thomas, developed this scheme where, on one side, you can say, here's all the attributes of God: creator, one, active, immutable, necessary, simple, infinite, eternal, absolute being. And here we are. We're created, we're many, we're passive, we're mutable, contingent, complex, finite, temporal, relative, becoming. So obviously, we don't have much in common with God. But God is benevolent and gracious to us. This is just another way of saying these attributes of God: pure actuality, immutability, impassibility, God cannot suffer, timeless, simple, etc. This in the Middle Ages developed this kind of mindset, right? So if we're here, right, on this scale of being, God is the most perfect being. And the earth, stones and dirt, would be the least perfect being. And so, in a sense, we would be oriented toward the perfection of being. So this kind of thinking, it's kind of what we call a Neoplatonic, there's a primacy of spirit over matter, meant that our focus was upward, right? God is above. Our attention is to go to heaven, right? And away from earth. And so we were not so earthbound as heaven-bound. This kind of thinking was also inscribed in the kind of cathedrals we built. This is the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. A little hazy, but you get the idea. It's like this iconic picture here. You walk into this cathedral and immediately your attention is lit. It's just drawn upward by these very, very high ceilings. And the whole idea is that we're lifted from earth up to heaven. Like, that's where our true reality is. That's where true being lies, the ultimate and absolute being of God. So we began to pray this way. Holy God, we praise thy name, a lifting up of our minds and hearts towards this God who's beyond us. We began to live this way, in a sense, orienting our thoughts and actions toward spiritual perfection and eternal life. And of course, that's how we began to shape life in this otherworldliness until science came along. And in the 16th century or so, when we began to develop telescopes to study the heavens, we realized, first thing, guess what? We're not static. This is not an Earth-centered universe. In fact, the sun seems to be the major star from which the planets, including Earth, are now rotating around. Well, that was very, very disturbing to the church, quite honestly. And so we had this idea that God was being pushed out of the cosmos by science, by forming these unnecessary hypotheses. Of course, Galileo is sort of the watershed in this story. Galileo was one who confirmed that we lived at that point in time, the 17th century, in a heliocentric universe. And of course, the Catholic Church said this to him in 1633. They said, the doctrine attributed to Copernicus that the earth moves around the sun and the sun stands at the center of the world without moving from east to west is contrary to Holy Scripture and therefore cannot be defended or held. So the church rejected heliocentrism, primarily because they said that it contradicted God's revelation in Scripture. As we read in Genesis, God created everything orderly, and therefore the earth must be at the center of the universe. Well, Rene Descartes in the next century also challenged this place of God in the universe and the question of what is God. So Descartes was nervous that, well, you really can't know anything for certain if it's all moving and changing. So he basically separated the mental world from the physical world. Our thinking self may not necessarily be tied part and parcel with our physical self. That was this idea of I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. And this kind of Cartesian dualism really was the rise of modern science. Well, if we don't have to worry about God anymore as the, the one who set it all in place and made the laws, now we can begin to use mathematics. We can use tools to study the heavens. So when Napoleon asked the mathematician Leibniz, where does God fit into your equations? Leibniz said, sir, I have no longer need of that hypothesis of God. Now we have science to answer the questions here. And of course, we know science cannot answer all our deepest questions. Isaac Newton thought that, this world was governed by its own lawfulness, right? And so he's the one who gave us the laws of thermodynamics, gave us a law of gravity. Newton was a deist, so he thought that God was more like a Florida God, kind of like, set everything in motion and that kind of retired to Florida, kind of just checked out, then check in periodically. And Newton's world is the world we're coming out of, actually. It's the kind of machinic-like world. You follow the rules. So you stop at the red light, stop at the stop sign, be kind to your neighbors, but we're not internally related in this world. This sketch by Escher kind of shows that we're each little units. We're individual units, and we have external relations in Newton's world, just like atoms do. So the idea is, well, keep the rule and the rule will keep you. And, that kind of world was good for us because that kind of world where you have predictability, right? I know my part in this machine and this is what I do, right? It's certainty. It has a control. It has a certain sense of control. So Newton's world was a very good model to begin to build an industrial age. And we began to build neighborhoods like this, little individual houses, and the way we structured ourselves as a society. There was certainty, hierarchy, kind of a vision, objective reality. So the mechanistic world, in a sense, became like a mechanistic church as well. Barbara Taylor Brown, wrote in one of her essays on the luminous web, walk into many churches and you will hear God described as a being who behaves almost as predictably as Newton's universe. Say you believe in God and you will be saved. Sin against God and you will be condemned. Say you're sorry and you will be forgiven. Obey the law and you'll be blessed. Right? That's how pretty mechanistic religion became. Like, just, ask God's forgiveness and, voila. And that's the kind of old God here, right? A God who is benevolent, but not too involved in this creation. A God who is an overseer, a God who is a good God, but you don't want to get on God's bad side. John Haught, my colleague, says, a religion built on stability and immutability is not prepared for a cosmic order based on change. I can't tell you how very, very important this saying is. We still haven't quite, taken hold of what this really means for us, but it really is important to do so now. There are three main levels of modern science that we should just be vaguely familiar with. One is the big picture, the Big Bang, and then there's the small picture of quantum reality, and then there is our story, which is evolution. So we're going to take just a brief spin on these in order to understand what does the word God mean in the world we actually live in, not in some, story from 1,000 years ago. First is the big picture. So we do not live in a three-tiered universe. We don't live in Ptolemy's cosmos. We live in this incredible, very elastic universe that was basically turned over into a new model from Newton's universe in the early 20th century by Albert Einstein, who realized that, well, Einstein never did a single experiment in his life, by the way. This is pure thought and mathematics. And he just basically had a very boring job and just one day was imagining, what if there's no such thing as absolute space and absolute time? And he began to imagine a beam of light, riding a beam of light at the speed of light. And he began to realize that time is really related to space, that space and time really depend where one finds oneself, right? So space-time is sort of a continuum. These are not two separate things. And it's rather flexible, and it can be changed. And so Einstein's laws gave rise to this idea of what I might call a bazooka bubblegum universe. You know, it can stretch. It's stretchy. It can shift its shape by depending on the gravity within it or the mass. And so it's a much more dynamic universe that we call the hot Big Bang cosmos. This is so different from any cosmos that Christianity has been born in or known about up till now. So one of the things is that this cosmology really demands a new theology. I mean, that's about as simple as one can say it. As far as we know, this cosmos is about 13.8 billion years old. I've seen more recent estimates of about 26 billion years old. There is still a lot of science going on with the early stages of this cosmos. Was there a Big Bang before us? We don't know. There are all sorts of speculations. We do know that at a particular point, there was a hot, dense explosion that rapidly cooled and gave rise to the forces of the universe that are now holding us in place. This is an immensely long amount of time, for stars and planets to form. Most of the cosmos being, in a sense, governed by dark energy and a smaller amount by dark matter. And therefore, what Einstein realized is that the basic stuff of the universe is energy. And you can think of this universe as an unfolding continuum of energetic relationships. We do know, just to keep us our sense of where we are in the cosmos in mind, we're just one of billions of galaxies. We're living on this middle-sized Milky Way galaxy. We're sort of in a suburban neighborhood of the universe that has about 200 billion stars or more and stretching about 100,000 light years. So we are one of billions and billions of galaxies, and galaxies are collections of stars. And we're probably, I'm going to just say, we're probably one of many universes as well, but that's a speculative statement. Don't hold me to the science on that. What we do know is that this universe is expanding, right? So nothing is in place, it's coming into being. That's the one thing about this universe that is extremely interesting, that space-time are the constant continuum of unfolding space-time, which is the kind of unfolding energy giving rise to matter. So it's expanding, and we feel ourselves expanding sometimes with the universe, which we know that we are part indeed of this universe. I think fundamentally what's good to keep in mind is it's a world of energy. And that's something that Einstein himself realized, that in that famous equation, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. That no matter, in fact, matter itself is a form of energy, right? Every piece of matter is energy packed into form. And so we can take this matter, and if we heat it up sufficiently, it'll evaporate, it'll disappear, it'll go into dust. If we freeze it, it goes into ice. The same mass, but different forms of matter. And so that's one aspect of energy. The second is that scientists realize that energy, the particles of energy are not easily identifiable. I mean, they're kind of weird. Like every particle of energy seems to have a wave-like characteristic and yet a particle-like effect. And so this term quantum reality refers kind of to the spookiness or the weirdness of energy particles. Energy is constantly in this kind of superimposed state of many possibilities. And, basically what we're saying here is that matter is not what we think it is. It's basically a bunch of energy relationships all the way down. And that's what's so interesting about this whole thing. As Niels Bohr said, everything we call real is made of things that cannot be regarded as real. So the question of reality has come into a whole new, conversation today. One thing about this energy relatedness is that when particles interact, they seem to forever interact. For example, if you take two particles and they interact so that their spins cancel out to zero, and then you separate them and put, say, one particle here on a desk in Villanova and the other particle, say, somewhere on Mars, that if I were to turn this particle 180 degrees up, the particle on Mars would turn 180 degrees down. So what we realize now is that once things are interact, they are forever interacting. And we call this non-local action at a distance or quantum entanglement. We also realize that for action, you don't have to be in direct relationship. Energy is such that it can act across vast amounts of space-time. We also realize that consciousness may work this way. So that, what we used to say was a coincidence that you were thinking about someone is now likely an entanglement with someone. So we live in this world of webs of relatedness. Cosmic life is intrinsically relational. And we can say that, there's this kind of undivided wholeness at the fundamental level of things, such that Paul Dirac said, it's so interconnected that if you pick a flower on Earth, you move the farthest star. Every human action is not a discrete, isolated action. It has its effects cosmically on everything we've interacted with and that's interacting with us. So why is it important for our discussion of God? Why should we talk about science at all? That's a huge question people have. And I find a lot of religious people don't understand, like, why should I pay attention to this stuff? Well, the truth is, our understanding of God from the very ancient, from the early Greeks onward into the Middle Ages, always began with study of the natural world, or what we might call science. And therefore, science always provided the grounds for philosophy, the grounds for reflecting on being itself. And philosophy, therefore, provided sort of the guide or the foundation for theology. How do we think about, if God is being, how do we think about God as being? So this relationship between science, philosophy, and theology, which was kind of lost, if I might say, in the 19th and 20th centuries, needs to be brought back into kind of not only just a philosophy of science, but a robust relationship between these three disciplines. So I put it this way: science is to philosophy what water is to the ocean, and philosophy is to theology what light is to vision. Without a robust science-informed philosophy, our theology is pretty well, it's just abstract ideas. It has no grounding. I also want you to note that our understanding of God needs to shift because we're no longer in Aristotle's world. I know it's just hard to believe, but we really have left Aristotle behind a long time ago. Aristotle was about substance, matter, and form, and we are in a post-Einsteinian universe of energy, relatedness, and complexity. Very different understandings of reality, which means that we are no longer in a mechanistic universe. This is part of our struggle today, by the way, as we're shifting through paradigms. That mechanistic universe was determinate. It had a certainty to it, a predictability, and a controllability. We're living in a universe of holism, but it's indeterminate. It's a world of quantum It's uncertain. It's ambiguous. We can't really tell anything anymore. How do we know anything with certainty? That's a huge question for us. And therefore, the world that we live in requires a new level of trust, of surrender, and of going with the flow, so to speak. One of the most important aspects of the new science, especially the new physics, is the role of consciousness. And I can't tell you how really fundamental consciousness now becomes to our understanding of existence itself. Early back in the 20th century, Bertrand Russell said, "We know nothing about the intrinsic quality of physical events except when these are mental events that we directly experience." In other words, having a conscious experience, we learn something about the intrinsic nature of physical stuff. For conscious experience is itself a form of physical stuff. Russell was basically saying consciousness is part and parcel of materiality. And therefore, the only way we can know something, materiality, is by way of consciousness. Max Planck said it even more kind of directly. "I regard consciousness as fundamental, and I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything we talk about, that we think about, begins with consciousness." We developed theology without consciousness, basically. I mean, the ancients didn't know about mind. I mean, they had some idea of mind, but it wasn't anything near what we know today about the relationship between consciousness and matter. And so they used consciousness, they used mind in a sense of the mind of God, or, a knowing of the soul. But we're not talking consciousness here in spirituality. We're saying consciousness is part and parcel of materiality. So stones have consciousness, trees have consciousness, the earth has consciousness, the sky is consciousness. And it's hard for us to get our heads around, but that is, in a sense, what science is holding out for us. David Bohm put it this way: "The notion of reality as a whole should be such to allow an understanding how reality and consciousness are related." That's a challenge for us. How are these related? And she said this way, Bohm said, if we understand that mind and matter are two aspects of the same reality, then as human beings and societies, we may seem separate, but in our roots, we're part of an indivisible whole, and we share in the same cosmic process. This is our fundamental reality. We are fundamentally one planet of life, one community of life. And again, in Bohm's words, the nature of the universe is undivided wholeness. This is our reality. We humans are the thinking portion of the universe. So it matters what we think. It's not like you can go off and think like, I think I'll hang on to medieval religion, or I really love Aristotle and I don't plan to give him up anytime soon, or I simply love Plato because he was simply the best. Well, you can love all these people, but the more our thoughts and our actions are out of sync with nature, the more we are dissociated from our cosmic roots. So that just brings me to the last of the science part, and that's evolution. That kind of neuralgic word that, people are still not all that happy with. But evolution just simply means unrolling the scroll. It's like you have a scroll all rolled up and you're starting to unroll it. It's like life is a story. That's just putting it simply. Life is a narrative, right? And so if you were to look at it as a narrative in terms of, say, an encyclopedia of 30 volumes, and you might have books in your office or your room where you are now, think of this as the story of evolution. In the one volume, each volume has 450 pages, and each page has 1,000,000 years. So volume 1 is the Big Bang. And then you have to skip over to volume 21, because those first 20 volumes are just about cosmic dust and cosmic unfolding, and a lot of darkness, quite honestly. Volume 22 is life. Then we go to volume 29, the Cambrian period, where we start developing into more advanced forms of life. Volume 30 the dinosaurs go extinct on page 385. Well, it's hard to believe that my nearer relative could be a dinosaur, but that's what this volume is telling me. Volume 30, the last line, the last two words of the last line are human beings. That would be us. And there's no period. It doesn't say, thank you for reading this, 30 volume encyclopedia. Please subscribe to Amazon if you like it. No final ending. So, basically, we are in evolution. And that's our most difficult thing to get our heads around. If we are in evolution, God is in evolution. Everything about us is in evolution. So what we're saying is nature is incomplete. There are no fixed essences. Obviously, if you stick around long enough, it's all going to change. Boundaries can change. Nature is oriented toward new and complex life. We go from single cells to little bunny rabbits to, well, you and me. And nature is marked by creativity and transcendence. It constantly wants something more. There's a moreness to nature, a perfectibility built into nature. So just these 2 points here. We don't go backwards, as far as we know. We're not going to get younger. We're not going to go back to being like little, amoebas. We're going to keep evolving towards something more complex. And the fastest evolver is by creative power, which means that, as Teilhard de Chardin, my guide to all things in the universe, says, it's the law of complexity consciousness. Stick around and things get more complexified, meaning more unified, more degrees of relationships. And so Teilhard thought that as things get more unified, consciousness rises. And that might seem like, boy, I'm not sure what I mean by that. Well, all you have to do is think of our technology, right? Some of you might remember the first iPhone, or you might even remember your phone on the wall with the cord, and I remember people saying that they were going to have a cell phone that you could put in your hand and carry around. And I thought, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. And then we got the cell phone. And then back in the 80s, they said they're going to put a computer in a phone. And I said, well, what's a computer? How can that possibly happen? And sure enough, they put the computer in the phone. And by the 90s, we had, late 90s, we had Google. So technology has rapidly evolved us to a state where we can't keep up with it. We're not sure where we're going with it. We know we need it because it's now running our world, but it's really an exponential evolver. Some things evolve and then some things don't evolve at the same time. So you can see here, I might speak for the Catholic Church that, a little bit slow on the, evolving side. So this brings me then to the question, which was raised by Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard was a French Jesuit, a paleontologist. So he was not a theologian, he was a scientist. His day job was digging up old bones in the desert to try to piece together an understanding of human origins. But he knew that that something was taking place with science and we can't hold on to the old God anymore. And so he said, who will give evolution its own God? That's a really important question for us. We can't keep talking about science with an old God. It doesn't work. We have to, in a sense, let go and allow ourselves to be grasped by this mystery that we name as God and to be taken up into a new understanding of God. And so, in a sense, we are shifting from this old view of the universe as closed and fixed to a new open and relational one. And this means that, as Teilhard recognized, the universe has to be regarded not as just a bunch of stuff like pieced together, an agglomeration of particles, but like an organism, like one whole body, interconnected, so intricate that no part of it can be clearly delineated from the whole. The whole is where we need to focus. It's the whole that is in evolution from the beginning, the whole mind, matter, soul, God, the whole thing. I just want to introduce quickly a colleague, not actually a colleague, a contemporary of Teilhard. This is, I should have put his name here, Alfred North Whitehead, the father of process reality, a mathematician turned philosopher who taught at Harvard. Why I want you just to briefly be familiar with Whitehead is because he is the one who introduced us to process theology. Our theology up till now has been a Thomistic theology, an Augustinian Thomistic theology. It's a theology based largely on Aristotle's philosophy, and it's based on participation in divine being. Process theology is a theology based on actually modern science. It's about relationship, it's about becoming, unfolding, something new is emerging, and the experience, right? It's about consciousness and experience. And so Whitehead and Hartshorne are two notable voices here. This is I'm gonna skip all the text, and you can have these slides so you can look them over when, before you go to bed every night. I'm only kidding. Basically what Whitehead realized is there's no such thing as just discrete particles. He was really looking at quantum physics and saying everything is a particle waves. So everything is sort of like, it's not like we're moving like bit to bit, where it's more like the ocean. It's like waves of an ocean. And so time itself is really a whole different trajectory here of time and space. I just want to point this out to you, just in case if you're not sure of these different types of God-world relationships. The one we've been used to, where, holy God, we praise thy name, the God above, is the kind of the supernatural God, what I might call the big guy in the sky God, who's very nice and looks over us and makes sure that all God's children are taken care of. Then we have pantheism, and this will be another discussion, but Teilhard actually espoused a Christian pantheism. God and world are really two aspects of the same reality. Then we have atheism, a world with no God. But then we have what process people call panentheism. God is in the world, and the world is in God. That's kind of a nice, kind of a dancing relationship. They're distinct, but actually fully interrelated. So here's what, Whitehead said: God and the world are mutually related. Mutually. So it means God affects the world, but guess what? The world can affect God. That's because God has a side which is infinite possibilities for Whitehead, a primordial side, and another side which is fully invested in nature, which is sort of luring nature, with new possibilities. And then nature makes a choice, and God is affected by that choice. And God takes that choice up into God's life, and then God's life changes. And so God is a co-sufferer with the world, a poet of the world, leading the world towards ever greater beauty. So this theology of process theology, and Teilhard is a process theologian as well. It's relational, it's interdependent, reality is dynamic, the future is open, God doesn't know the future. In fact, in process reality, God is not really omnipotent. God is, you might say, a power of lore, but God doesn't have the absolute power to, make mountains move and, makes things stop happening. Because the freedom is real, and God builds freedom into God's own life and the life of creation itself. So for process theologians like Whitehead and Teilhard, the universe is creative, it's interrelational, it's dynamic, it's open to the future, which means God is relational. God is present in every moment of our lives. The world, in a sense, is like a big, giant ecosystem where what harms one or blesses one harms or blesses all, including God. So, this is the type of God Teilhard himself came to realize, a God who is really in need and in love with the world to be God. And we have this famous saying of Teilhard, I just threw it in here just in case, you want some familiarity. But he said, someday after we master the winds, the waves, the tides, and the gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And for the second time in the history of the world, humanity will have discovered fire. So in my last few minutes, I just want to talk about why love for Teilhard is, in a sense, the greatest real presence of divine reality at the heart of our lives. First of all, Teilhard thought, look, we haven't grown cold. I mean, it has grown cold, he said, but we're ardently searching for a God proportionate to the newly discovered immensities of a universe whose aspect exceeds the present compass of our power of worship. Well, I don't know about you, but where I go to Mass on Sunday, I can tell you that this saying is really true. We're still, in the Catholic Church, we're still between the 5th and 13th centuries, maybe a little updating to a little early 20th maybe, but it's it doesn't really encompass the world in which we live. Teilhard thought that God has become too small to nourish in us the desire to go on living and to live on a plane of higher life. He says, science now tells us the cosmos has become a cosmogenesis. That's the Big Bang, by the way. It's still birthing. And this fact alone must lead to a profound modification of the whole structure, not only of our thoughts, he says, but of our beliefs. And we have beliefs that have been relatively, essentially unchanged for centuries. Just to throw in another name here, because I think Tillich, like Whitehead, helps support what Teilhard is trying to get at. First of all, Paul Tillich revisits the name God. And he's like, especially in the 20th century where everyone is arguing God is dead, look at the world, it's such a mess, God is dead, there's no more God. And he says, well, God is not a thing beside other things within the universe of existing things. That's number one. You can't argue for or against God because God is not subject to argument. God is being itself. So you can't make God into like a big one of us and then try to defend that whether or not God exists. God is not an object to behold, but the ground of experience. For Tillich, God and religion is the place of ultimate concern. It's what gets us up in the morning, so to speak. So what Tillich said is, beneath the surface of things, God's not up in the sky that God has to, come down and do something for us. He says, beneath the surface, there is an infinite and inexhaustible dimension, that should be inexhaustible, depth, an experience of ultimacy of being and meaning. And he says the name of this infinite and inexhaustible depth is God. It's like when you're at the seashore and you see the sun setting. And there's something that's so immensely awesome. And it just speaks to us of a depth within nature itself that's just not reduced to, say, photosynthesis, or just what science can tell us. There's something that's beyond science. It's ungraspable. And that depth is God. And so Tillich says, if you say life has depth, you cannot be an atheist. In a sense, God is that horizon or that depth or that ground of all that is, so that God is, you might say, the possibility of the impossible, right? What seems like this is not possible, beneath that which seems, there's an inexhaustible depth, and that's God. So this is one of my favorite names for God, the possibility of the impossible. Teilhard himself thought, he had a similar experience. As a scientist, he was very earthbound. And he says that as he was touching rocks and feeling the dirt, he found an absolute that drew him and yet remained hidden. And he seemed to sink into matter. Matter wasn't something to escape, or it wasn't a stepping stone to spirit. He found that spiritual depth from which he was yearning, the essence from which all emerges, precisely in and through the material world. So he put it in this way: experiencing the stuff of matter. The stuff of matter, a presence, he said, the consciousness of a deep running current in matter. It's like the way we have treated things in the earth is very Thomistic, quite honestly. It's like, this is another rock. This is another seashell. Well, I can get another seashell if I lose that one. We've lost sense of the incredible giftedness of every aspect of nature, of creation. That this star, this grain of sand, this rock, this tree holds within it an infinite depth of divine love in an inexhaustible way. So that Teilhard says the stuff began to emerge in the direction of a fundamental basis of everything. Matter became for him the place of the absolute. Therefore, Teilhard turned his attention to what was taking place in matter, in a world of evolution. We are not here yet. We're still a little bit platonic, matter's very nice. We're very concerned about it. But really, our real emphasis is on spirituality. It's on the God ahead of us, behind us, before us, beyond us, but not here in this moment of materiality. So here's what Teilhard, this is kind of how, this is John Haught, he interprets Teilhard this way. If the whole universe is this energetic, dynamic unfolding of space of matter, that's really what it is. It's a dynamic unfolding of matter. And in sense, God must be unfolding with it. If God is the ground and depth of all that is, then we must say that that God is part of whatever is taking place. And therefore, what if the universe is waking up to something infinitely larger and deeper than itself? That's a great question. That's a God question. And we have to shift our thinking about God in relation to the world to really enter into this question. So I'm looking at time, and you just let me know. You just say we've had enough. But I might, let me see where I am, if you don't mind. Then I can tell you if we have a few more. Do you want to continue, or do you want to stop for the moment and
I'd,
just?
I'd say go ahead, Ilia, and continue a bit, maybe 5-10 minutes.
Okay, that's fine with
That's
me. I
good.
want to make
Okay.
still in this trajectory of evolution.
Yes.
So what if this universe is waking up? That's a huge question, right? Because something is taking place, quite honestly. Technology is driving it, quite honestly, to more consciousness. We're more aware today of belonging to a single, Earth community. We're more aware today of everything happening around the globe. But even more than being that awareness, there is something that is taking place even beneath the surface of things. And that's what we want to look at. Teilhard thought there's a prime energy at the heart of evolution. And the way he put it this way, he said, well, there's really two types of energy. One is, we might say, a withinness. What we might say the energy of transcendence, and that's related to consciousness. Like when I become aware of something, I'm drawn beyond myself in that moment towards that which I'm aware of. But he says there's also an energy of attraction that he calls this withoutness, or the attraction of matter, that as I'm aware of something, I'm pulled towards it. And so these two energies he pulled together and said that love is both the energy of transcendence and it's the energy of union. And it's true, right? When love itself as an irresistible force pulls us beyond ourselves towards something other that we're drawn to, and we unite in some way. So he speaks of love not on the human level, by the way, but as a cosmological force. In other words, a force of energy present from the Big Bang in molecular forces. So for Teilhard, quarks have love energy, cells have love energy, plants have love energy, and it's about attraction, union, and transcendence or emergence. So he puts it this way: driven by the forces of love, the fragments of the world are seeking each other so that the world may come into being. Isn't that a great insight? Driven by the forces of love. Love as an irresistible, unquenchable energy. The fragments of the world are seeking each other so that the world may come into being. So we're not quite yet what we have the potential to be. And therefore he says, well, what's guiding this process? How come we haven't gone fully extinct? I mean, we've had 5 extinctions actually on this planet, and yet life keeps popping up and getting more complex. That's pretty amazing. After, I don't know, 4.2 billion years of Earth life, I'm not sure how we're still here. And yet here we are. And so he says there's something guiding it. And he calls this principle of centration, something keeping the center more centered as life complexifies. He calls this omega. I am the alpha and the omega. Could be it's a symbol of God, a presence of God, divine love energy, or just simply the whole of the whole. This is how Teilhard says, there's he found this presence, within everything, like this current. And then he says, this presence became symbolized by omega as a new and vital presence of God. Now, this becomes important for him. This is not a God draping the world with power, he says. Here's the key point. But a God integral to the world's becoming. We are in a very, very different worldview from Thomas Aquinas now. Thomas would have said, oh my God, never, never, never. As a lot of people still do, who hold on to that old Christian worldview. No way, Jose, can God ever be part of the world's becoming. But if we get our philosophy and science correct, our theology will have to follow. And therefore, I've called this a God-world entanglement. A God-world entanglement. We are so integrally part of God's life, and God is so integrally part of our lives that we mutually affect one another. And therefore, let me just concentrate on the 3 dots in the middle. As God changes the world from the depths of matter to the peaks of spirit, the world enfolds God. So God is always constantly becoming more and more God as life becomes more whole and conscious. God and matter are, in a sense, rising to a new reality. So Teilhard writes, as a direct consequence of this unitive process by which God is revealed to us, God in some way transforms himself as he incorporates us. This is a true process theology. God is changed as God's life is affected by our lives, and our lives are changed as we are affected by God's life. We come into now a kind of a new complexified reality together. And this is what Teilhard says: God and the world are in the process of becoming something more together because the universe is grounded in love. So he says the evolution of God and the evolution of humanity cannot be separated. One thing we have to say about Teilhard's God, God is unfinished. God is becoming God in and through the world. And the world is becoming world in and through God. And that's what he means. There's only one real evolution, and that's the evolution of convergence. Something is coming together in a unified way. And so Teilhard says, without matter, we would remain ignorant both of ourselves and of God. So he writes this beautiful prayer, which I think I'll close with this evening. I bless you, matter, in your totality and your true nature, You I acclaim as the inexhaustible potentiality for existence and transformation. I acclaim you as the universal power which brings together and unites. I acclaim you as the divine milieu charged with creative power. Raise me up then, matter, until at long last it becomes possible for me in perfect chastity to embrace the universe. This is a very, so all that Teilhard is saying here is really summed up in the mystery of Christ. And that's really where he sees this center is this center of Omega becomes the Christic center. God is becoming something more in and through matter, and matter is becoming something more in and through relationship with God. So what I thought is that I just want to see where I am, just to see. Yeah, well, it's kind of the same thing. I can continue that next week. So I will stop here because we could take some time for discussion or questions. Then you can have your breakout session. And then next week, I'd like to continue with Christogenesis. And then if you understand this part of the story, you'll understand why Christogenesis really follows and what that means for our planet today.
So, Sister Ilia, how does this change your idea of corporate worship? This new idea. For me, worship is a centrality of part of my faith, and so I'm just kind of wondering how to reframe this for corporate worship.
So I think actually, I'm worship, but I know where I worship. I think this type of theology could be a more participatory type of corporate worship. I think right now, I think we have still a highly individualistic. People come, they're quote unquote in community, but it's still an individual in community. And I think we need new symbols and new prayers and new kind of rituals to gather us. Like it's an energizing of a collective whole. And I think that's the question. Teilhard himself thought that, with a new theology, we need new forms of worship. And I think we have been reluctant to do that. And do our symbols still hold the type of value that can pull us into this kind of energized wholeness that we are part of something together? So the whole thing could be deeply liturgical, but I think we have a lot of work to do on the prayer side, the ritual side, and the side of symbols.
Yeah, because liturgy means the work of the people.
Yes. I agree. And I find, quite honestly, a lot of the work is being done by the celebrant, and the people are passive. And they're just kind of there to, listen and just respond. But this would be so if we take this theology seriously, it has to be a mutual relatedness between celebrant and congregation, and that's what I think needs work.
Thank you, Brother Ken. Carl.
First, thank you so much, Ilia. I love your presentation. It's so meaningful. It really speaks to us, I believe. And I think within our churches, we have so many elements of it. It just gets lost, what you do to the least of me, you do to me, right? We're all interconnected. So it's there.
Yes.
I assume our essential needs are that help protect us and get us to grow and learn, also gets in the way when that becomes our God,
Yeah.
And I would call it corporal sin or corporate or institutional, because because the institutions are made of us humans, and we are all I think want to lack the consciousness of the reality, because the old way is kind of nice. I just go and say my prayers and name the Father. Oh, the world's great. get those out of my country. You know, there's no borders when we look at the earth. And I think the conscious, and I would call it consciousness of the churches, all the different denominations, or many of them, want to survive, and they're afraid of change. What do you think of that?
Well, let me say, yeah, you said a number of things that are really important here. So let me kind of parse out a few things. One, I think there's absolutely no contradiction between scripture and science. In fact, actually, if we went back to the scriptures, the Old Testament into the New Testament is very consistent with biblical promise and what God is, in a sense, showing us in the, God has a vision, there's something there of a new heaven and a new earth. I find the whole New Testament, it's forward looking. Jesus is about something new, breaking in. And I think what we've really failed to emphasize in the New Testament is the creativity, the creative imagination. Jesus was filled with imagination, but we've become, you're right, a very passive, and we're comfortable. You use the word comfortable. I think that's absolutely right. We've become mediocre, and we are comfortable. We don't want to be disturbed too much. And actually what will happen is Christianity will it's going to wear down. It's something new is taking place. I mean, in a sense, our whole political chaos right now is just a bit of a sign for it. And one of the maxims, if I can just add this to you, of technology is religion has failed. Technology will now fulfill what religion promises. Technology is built on the principles of the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's salvation, it's immortality, it's we can create a new world together. And Christians have been way, way too passive, too worried about losing something precious and vital, and it will be lost. Precisely. If you try to hold on to something, Jesus said, you will lose it. If you lose something for the sake of the reign of God, you will gain something new. And somehow that lesson just never kind of filtered into our heads. We're pretty sure if we try to hold on to it, it's going to preserve. That's just not the New Testament. It's not even Jesus. It's deep, deep fear. And fear paralyzes us. And I think what we are called to is a radical love and a radical trust in a God who is doing new things. So I would say.
Thank you, Ilia. Celeste?
Hi, Ilia. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm a member of a Christophany group, so I just love this. I can't get enough of this. And I have to say, I have to confess that once you really open your mind and your heart and your imagination to what is being suggested here, our church is so terribly irrelevant that for me, to go to Mass is painful. It's not only does it not speak to me, the whole liturgy is based on an atonement theory that, was a misinterpretation of everything that Jesus did. And the prayers that we pray, many of them are very beautiful, especially the ones that talk about love. And but the thing is, there is so much power and so much awe in the universe itself. If we just went to church and learned this, this would be enough to kind of reinforce this notion of a very powerful, alive God. But anyway, my question is something different, which is if both humans and God, if the whole universe is evolving along with God, what's the difference between God and humans?
That's a great.
Yeah, and I wonder if it has something to do with that notion of the Christ, but I haven't really, the question just jumped in my head as you were presenting, so I haven't had a chance to really think about that. So
Very good theological question. So yeah, is there a difference? Otherwise, what we have is strict pantheism. In other words, we do God everything us and we'd be God. And so, oh, that's kind of scary, actually.
Yes, it is.
God is, think of God as the overflow. Divinity is the overflow. Transcendence means nothing finite or contingent can contain it. So when we say God is the ground, God is the horizon of our being. We can never grasp God. God can never be exhausted by anything finite or anything created. That God is that by divinity itself, it exceeds divinity. God exceeds any finite or contingent boundaries. So God, in that sense, is wholly other, in that sense, that God is not at the whim of contingent finite reality. And I think God, when I say God is infinite possibility, I think that's what the name God is: infinite love, infinite beyond any number of universes that we could imagine. And that's not us, right? We're finite, we're contingent. My love does get limited, and so I do wear down, and therefore I am not God. And yet, the beauty of it is that I am part of God's life, and yet I'm not God. And it's a mystery, right? So it's not that I can say, oh, this is God and this is not God. So that is the mystery of Christ. You're right. In that sense, there's something, that's powerfully alive in Jesus. The Father and I are one. And yet, even Jesus himself, I think, didn't fully, I must go that the Spirit might come, So Jesus knew the limits of his life. There was something even more, that going on there, and that had to be continued through the work of the Spirit in all life to follow. So I do think keeping God, keeping God as, and I like the power of love. That's one way that I would conceive of God. And so that no matter what happens, that there is an unquenchable power of love here, that if we tap into that power of creative love, daring love, adventurous love, the love that does really crazy things, that God is part of our lives, and therefore empowers us in a sense to do new things as well.
Thank you.
How about Elise? Oh, I'm sorry. 1 second, Dennis. I see you're ahead of.
Thank you. I think this is somewhat related to Celeste's issue, perhaps. I'm wondering, referencing the diagram about pantheism and panentheism, might there be a third alternative to those to account for God always being a part of the world without the world being the same as God?
Yes, that's called panentheism.
No, but I mean, even I'm thinking about the diagram you have. They overlap, but there's a part of the world where God is not, and that doesn't seem to square with what we're talking about.
Yes. Right. Well, don't worry. I didn't do that diagram myself.
Oh, okay.
So that was a quick lift from a Google, the internet.
Okay.
You're right. Yeah, I think we need a kind of a way of visualizing that God is part and parcel of the world. The term that Raymond Panikar used is cosmotheandrism. And I'll write it in the chat so you can see it. It sounds like one of those, theandrism, one of those mouthful of words, but it's cosmos, theos, and anthropos. So it's this interconnected, interrelated reality, like a Trinitarian reality of God, human, cosmos, that they cannot be separated. And how to visualize that, sort of like a Venn diagram of some sort, or, that's where we need an artist, and we need ways of expressing these new realities to help us get a sense, a visualization of what a God who is completely entangled with this world might look like. And we're entangled with this godly life, and yet we're not God, and yet we're in this mystery of God. And that's the beauty of it. It's an insoluble, it's not a binary either or thing. It's that openness of ever creative energy and love in this mystery of God life.
Thank you. Elise.
Thank you. Thanks. Ilia, we have a little entanglement. I'm at Villanova. I'm at St. Thomas of Villanova, and I'm the director of religious education there. So you're the perfect person for me to be a student of. Father Frank actually was a student in your class, and he did one of our one of our retreats. I had already known of you, thankfully, so it was a really good. But Ilia, so in that direction with the children, who could you lead me in the direction of what, our catechism, I don't have to tell you, is in desperate need of an overhaul. The children are just in love with story, obviously, and the storytelling. I feel like this, honestly, they would be so open to understanding, the continuation. They do get more and more than even obviously those of us who are watching this did as we were growing up. But I do think that they're ready, they're more than ready for it only all the time. So how would you lead me?
That's a great question. Let me just tell you, so you're dealing with kids, and this is the important part. Like, we really do need a catechesis that has a cosmotheandry built into it, like a God for our world that's unfolding. So my 18-year-old students and 19-year-old at, Villanova, we're having this discussion in the last few weeks on science and religion and, a God of evolution. And I'll tell you two things. That one, they're like, no one ever talks about this. This is the first time we're hearing this, and this makes sense, So they're so excited. One freshman was so excited. She wrote me at 8 a.m. the next morning and said, no, all my Catholic education, she said, no one ever talked about science, and I couldn't understand how science and religion could fit together. She said, it's been a problem for me up until now. So she was calling her parents and telling her what was going on in class. Second is, our kids today know more science by fourth grade than we know at 50 years old. They can tell you all about the Big Bang. They can tell you all about evolution. But we have a theology that keeps people, quite honestly, at a first grade level. It's like, so we're very sophisticated in scientific knowledge, and our theology is so primitive because it's still, God made me to know him, love him, and serve him in this life and to the next. It's like, so kids learn that stuff, they're in, and then it's out. So what do? Well, first of all, you're right. Narratives are important, and therefore I would suggest there are children's books just on the evolutionary story by Jennifer Morgan, and they're all illustrated, and they're excellent. She has a whole series on the Big Bang, on evolution. And if you want to learn the new science by way of children's books, Jennifer Morgan is one place to go to. We have we have very nothing on catechesis or pedagogy, on religious education levels for children. So we are just getting our heads around it. And so it's just hard. But I would begin with the stories, and you know what? Kids know more than they appear to know. So if you just give them the evolutionary story and you say, what does God look like? What do you think God is here? And you'll be amazed at how they, come out with stories, with insights. Or where might you see, love in this? And you're gonna have to create your own catechesis here, basically. There's nothing written that I know of.
Right. Well, and as you're saying, though, it is literally what they already know. So in other words, they are very aware. They know evolution. They understand. So this would be so easy to fit in terms of, but I do have to build it out. Perhaps some of your students would then come down because, a lot of them actually, I do already have 4 Villanova students who are teachers. So we'll just have to get something going with that. A training, if you will. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This has really been stimulating. I put a question in the chat. Let me just read it briefly. I said, why must we hang on to the notion of God, continually evolving the definition to fit what we keep learning? We now know we were created from stardust. Why must we insist that there is a God in some sense in the stardust? Cannot we be spiritual without being God believing?
Well, yeah, I like the word God personally. So there, and here's why. I'll tell you why. Because I think there, I mean, certainly there's something that calls me. And it's about a personal call. Like every person has a call to do something, to be something, a sense of purpose. Like it's that call for meaning in one's life. Who do I exist for? And so I think God is, first of all, it's not a being. Certainly, God is not like a big being like you and me. God is the open question in a sense. And you might say that question that calls me, like, I'm called into life this day. And what am I called into? What am I called to do? What do I live for? And so I think God is that name of ultimate concern. So it's whatever, this reality of God, this kind of this beingness of love that calls us into life can go by whatever name you are most comfortable with. I mean, I like the name God, but you might call God, the great compassionate one. You might call God love itself, or just, whatever it is. But what I like is a name that calls us by name. I have called you by name and you are mine, as we read from the psalmist. And that's what's so beautiful. I think the Psalms, give to us a God who's deeply and personally related to us. This is not God like the big matrix. God's not like a computer simulator, and we're not just algorithms. We are deeply loved into being in a particular way. Like your personhood of Courtney is unique and distinct for all eternity. There'll never be another Courtney on this earth ever again, in the universe or any universe. And that's the mystery of God. So Courtney, I would just say, find whatever name, makes you most comfortable with this mystery at the heart of your life. Next week, I want to do Christogenesis, and the way into that is through the mystic consciousness. Yeah. We can talk about the levels of consciousness next week. Is that okay? Can you hold on till then? Great.
Very good. Well, thank you, Ilia. Wonderful. So rich.
Nice to be with
I-
you. Okay.
We're grateful, and we do look forward very much to having you back next week at the same time.